Hi folks, Austin Sendek here, founder and CEO at Aionics. And in this video, we're going to share the Q&A audio from Fortnightly number 8 with Venkat Viswanathan, the episode titled Battery Materials Informatics, Are We Ready for Primetime? So we're just going to have the audio here and we'll just have a video just as a placeholder. So I hope you enjoy it and I'll cut it in beginning now. Just sort of open it up if you want to just raise your hand or type it in the Q&A box. Feel free. Okay, we have a question from Max. On the topic of mindset, how do you encourage buy-in from other scientists who are using traditional research approaches? How do you convince them that these approaches augment the domain knowledge that they have? And how do you incorporate their domain knowledge into ML workflows? That's a great question. Oh, Venkat, you're muted.
Yeah, so great question, Max. So it's a tricky thing. I think it really has to be a joint effort, and I think start small and scope out a project where maybe it's a pet project for them or a side project for them. That's not their bottom line, and try to sort of get them to sort of buy in that, okay, let's try it out for this small project, and then try to use this, and then hopefully there'll be some success from that, and then from that you can sort of get buy-in. Now, how do you incorporate domain knowledge, right? So domain knowledge can come in a variety of forms. And I think I just would like to sort of point out the distinction. So domain knowledge can be that domain knowledge can come from identifying the problem space, right? So identifying this is the right problem to work on. Okay, that's a great way of using domain knowledge. Second is using domain knowledge to identify the design space. So in that problem, which part of the design space should I be searching in? That's another place where domain knowledge is very good at. There might be inside that what kind of features that might be important or what kind of properties that might be important. There also domain knowledge is very important. The place where I think domain knowledge is overrated and where the biggest problem comes is when someone says, okay, the data says this material is bad, but like I really think this material is good, right? So that kind of intuition, I think I'm now convinced, at least personally, that kind of intuition we're very, very bad at, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying inside our brains to build a neural network that basically takes some features and then outputs the label, which is whether it's good or not, right? And any computer-based neural network is actually, or a computer-based model is actually better than humans at that. So the last part is where I think encouraging people to not think in that dimension, but think in the dimensions of, okay, here are the ways in which you incorporate domain knowledge. I think that's very important, and it's very important that people think that this is a cooperative journey, right? That it's not that this is replacing you, and this is really sort of augmenting your ability. And so one way to think about it, right, is any computational researcher knows this, right? That whenever they're sleeping, they want all these jobs to be running on a cluster, right? So what are you doing, right? You have workers that are working for you while you're sleeping, right? In the same way, right? I think we want the same kind of thing in the sort of in the digital, in the hardware space, right? Which is that you want to be inferring on real data and experiments when you're not, or maybe when you're sleeping, right? Which is basically these things are doing the inference for you to ensure that you don't have to spend as much time, right? So it's a cooperative journey. I think it's very important that it's cooperative, right? So view it as it's a way to give you superpower, right? So what you could achieve in a month, what you could achieve in a year before, you can now achieve in a month, right? So easily gaining like tenfold improvement is very much possible.
Great, thanks, Venkat. Any other thoughts? I have a question that I wanted to put to you, Venkat. So you mentioned, I think in your one of your first slides, you were sort of joking about putting data in table S3 in in the S side of your paper. And writing that ion conductor paper was, I mean, the first few months were just a slog of like manually, copying data out of PDFs, by hand. What do you think the scientific community should be doing, or what is the community already doing well to make this process of kind of data sharing and reproducibility better?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, maybe Dilip is also in the audience. He may also want to chime in. He also did a similar thing for the Camlet-TAF data set, where he hand curated like 300 data points, and it was super painful. And you realize that people have miscopied the table values and so on, right? So you couldn't find the original reference and so on. So it's I'd love to sort of hear his viewpoint also at the end. But I think there's a lot that's going on. I have been part of this accelerating, part of this effort to try and accelerate data sharing in a way that is fair, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Most NSF awards actually now require you to submit a data management plan where this issue of fair is really highlighted. We now, with all our papers, try to release the code. We made a big deal out of these, the field of phase field simulations, where there was basically no open source code. So we put out the first open source code, or open source. There are open source codes, but there are not the simulation files associated with those papers. We made it such that we shared the files. It's been an amazing reaction to that, right? There's so many people that essentially could do these baseline simulations, which everyone should be doing. So on the data side, I think there's a lot that's going on in making it conform to FAIR. There's also a lot of effort in trying to sort of curate different data sets. So we're trying to sort of build this effort called Battery Data Commons, sort of the idea that we'd have sort of all kinds of battery data that you can curate. There's of course an effort called batteryarchive.org, which is also curating a lot of these things. And I think the next generation of students, right, they realize from their own pain of table S3 or that it's better as a CSV that goes, and I think it has to go along with journals changing their mindset, right? Like if you give them the CSV, right, ACS journals, still don't really have a clever way to handle it or render it or like any of those things or like interact with it. So I think journals should sort of also adapt to some of these things. I think the launch of the journal Scientific Data is really important. I think that has enabled the data mindset to be more widely. I think the recognition that curation of data and sort of careful labeling of data is also appreciated, right? And in fact, I think there's some very high quality. In fact, my 0th PhD student Abhishek went on to curate this EquSolDB, Equisolvation database, which is basically the benchmark database in that field, right? And all of that was inspired from our from the sort of original data curation efforts that he spearheaded. I think there's a lot of activity and momentum in this space. I am very optimistic for the next few years in terms of data sharing that is usable and reusable. Maybe Dilip would like to chime in. Maybe we'll allow him to talk.
Sure. I hope you all can hear me, and happy to share some of my thoughts from my experience. And of course, this has been jointly with Venkat. And the specific case that Venkat was referring to, the Camlet-TAF parameters, is one where the size of data was a little over 250 or so. And so, it was super obvious that the most important thing to do was really manually go through all of those data points and curate them carefully. And one thing I want to emphasize is, especially when you're doing deep neural networks, right? You have a lot of parameters, and if you want to learn especially in the low data regime, it's even more important to pay close attention to the quality of the data set. And one might be able to get away with this sort of a thing while doing shallow learning, because you might not penalize certain outliers as much in these cases. So just want to make that point about deep learning versus shallow learning. And especially in the low data regime, if you're trying to build deeper models, extremely important to carefully curate the data set. And we've had some very interesting learning on this front, where even if you brought in 2 data points that were corrupted, your predictions on your test data set would drastically change. And these are things that will probably agree with what Austin has been seeing, because remember some of his work where he was also talking about small data sets and learning effectively in the low data regime. So yeah, no, these are some of my thoughts, and concur with Venkat on all of the things he said about data quality that becomes of prime importance in these contexts.
Super, thanks, Dilip. All right, a couple more. Should I take Rupak's question first, Austin? What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, these are both great questions. I know we're a bit over time, so if anyone needs to drop off, please feel free. But I do want to make sure we get through these. So yeah, let's whatever order you want to take them in there, Venkat.
Yeah. So Rupak has a very interesting question around augmenting models with more complex measurements of material properties. So prioritizing slow, careful measurements that produce high quality data in regions of the design space where material property predictions are highly uncertain. Okay. So I think this is a fantastic question, right? Also a little bit of exploration versus exploitation. And it's actually something that is very critical and often missed, right? So if you actually want to do something as a company, right, you actually want to invent, right? So which means that you necessarily want to be in a region where your traditional data, I mean, the traditional data searches and databases are built around regions of the design space that people understand really well. But when you're a company, when you're trying to file IP, you have to necessarily be in a design space where there is not a lot of data, right? So so there's actually a really important point that emerges where, if you want to invent and file new intellectual property, it becomes extra important to go to these regions where property predictions are uncertain or you don't know much. Of course, that means that the likelihood to fail will also be higher, but I think the likelihood to generate new IP is also higher. So I think this is also a challenge, both in the materials informatics side, because we need to be able to extrapolate to these design spaces. And the value of high quality, careful experiments, I cannot emphasize enough that, right? So, eventually the joke is that, Dilip curated all of these additional things that were measured by other people. Eventually, we realized that the model that we could have built by the original data set curated by Camlet and Taft was probably enough, right? So, that sort of shows the importance of the the quality of the data in being able to infer out of domain. So I think slow, careful measurements. I think that there's just no substitute to, if I were to pick, right, I would pick smaller number of high quality data versus a large number of low fidelity or moderate fidelity data. I think that's what I would prioritize. Okay, all right. So let's maybe go to Michael's question. So Michael asks about trust. Trust is a key component of receptiveness to theoretical and computational tools. So how do you sort of calibrate the expectations and avoid overpromising? Okay, so this is a very tricky question. I think ultimately, in my own experience, the following is very difficult, right? So being able to quantitatively say that that something is X% better or Y% better, so what I call the regression problem, right, is very difficult in general, right, with computational tools to connect to realistic experiments. What is, however, really feasible today is whether X is better than Y, right, the classification problem, right? So I think being, and in fact, oftentimes classification is pretty good, right? All you want to know is, okay, should I test Y or not, right? Should I, I know X, should I test Y, right? So there's sort of tension around regression versus classification. And I think many times, I think many theoretical efforts sort of get sort of caught in trying to match an experiment. We never try to match an experiment. In fact, one of the things that I learned early on in my PhD was there was a plot I made, and like it neatly matched with the experiment. And my advisor said that you should never put the theory line on the same as the experimental graph, because that means that you somehow expect that those two should be similar, right? So from that, I actually always try to separate those two graphs, right? If you're predicting the same quantity, right? If you're trying to sort of estimate the same quantity. And so I think it's really important to sort of live with that reality that there will be a lot of things that you won't capture, right? But we don't need to capture all that, right? We don't need to capture all that for these things to become useful, become practically relevant, and being able to scale. Okay, all right. Lenson asks, it's intuitive to make your models and data fair when your data and models are parametric. How do we think about fairness when the predictive models are too complex to describe on paper? Okay, I don't think I fully understand the question, so I'm going to ask Lenson to maybe elaborate on it.
Sure. Like if I have a table of data and I understand that I can do regression on it and report both the table and the parameters in my regression model, then it's easy to reproduce. If my data are structured in some complex way and I use like a deep learning approach to get my predictions, how am I ever supposed to make that reproducible, for example?
Yeah, I mean, you can. Okay, good. I get the question. So you can still share. I mean, I think this is a very good question, right? Around reproducibility of deep learning models. I think first step is to try and ensure that you put your random seed to be the same, and try to see if try to ensure that your code is, your deep learning model is reproducible to the extent possible. Another way is ensemble of deep learning models, which I think gives confidence that sort of the different models collectively, I think, will give the same distribution as any one model. So that's something that that we have seen. I think it's a really important question around sort of how do you get deep learning models to be sort of really reproducible. I think it's an active area of research. So I think it's still to be TBD in terms of what the best practices are. But I think still, I mean, I think essentially if you at least share your code and try to ensure some things around setting the random seeds and giving all of the sort of training parameters, you hope that it would be reproducible. But of course, when code bases upgrade, right, then that adds another level of complexity, right? So it becomes very difficult as sort of time evolves, right? It's not like if we had the simulation file from 1999 to run in VASP 1.0 that we can actually reproduce it today, right? So so I think this is an area where we need someone to sort of upkeep, so to speak, the old data to sort of modernize that so to speak. But it's a very important question.
All right. Well, thanks for answering those questions, Venkat. And I will close this out with one more question for you, which is obviously a leading question, which is, are we ready for prime time? I think well and truly, right? I think we're absolutely ready. And I made this comment yesterday in this panel, right? That in order to meet the climate change problem, we need like 100 Aionics like companies accelerating all of the sectors, right? Bill Gates wrote this very interesting book on how to avoid a climate disaster, where he highlights numerous design spaces, numerous problem spaces where we need innovation, right? Lots and lots of innovation, right? And in fact,
There's some spaces where they're sitting in the idea generation phase, right? Lucky that in the battery space, we're sitting more in the materials optimization phase, right? There are other areas like cement, fertilizer, aviation, etc., where we don't even have good solutions in terms of energy efficient processes that can sort of replace that, right? So I think materials informatics today is orders of magnitude better than where it was 5 years ago, right? 5 years ago, I would have said the answer was overwhelmingly no, right? And now I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes for companies that that know the problems they want to solve and have a good idea of how to approach the problem. Right? I don't think we need the solution necessarily, but we just need to know how to approach the problem. And as long as you know how to approach the problem, all of these methods can augment your approach and make it make it better and accelerate the rate at which you will discover new things. Most importantly, I think this is the thing that I would highlight and close is most importantly, it can help you better catch false positives and false negatives, right? I think, and it's underappreciated the effects of false positives and false negatives. False positives are okay; they usually will get caught. False negatives are very, very problematic, and false negatives, especially in design spaces where there are not a lot of solutions, missing them would be a sort of dire consequence for these projects. So I think these methods are extraordinarily good today at being able to catch false positives and false negatives. If nothing else, just that brings exponential value in terms of optimizing these materials. So with that, I'll close and thanks, Austin, for the opportunity to present this.
All right, thank you for presenting. Thank you everyone for being here. This was a really great discussion, really cool. And thanks for being here, and we will see you all next time.